I'm just going to read a little bit about what you probably got through the email. She is a Bible college and seminary grad and has served at Hope numerous positions over the years. She is currently working in mental health and extreme trauma with ministry and secular organizational leaders. She has had her own counseling business for 14 years and has traveled all over the world helping people handle trauma situations affecting their lives. She is planning to go to Iraq at the end of August. On a personal note, I've known Nancy all the years she's been here at Hope, and she has been such a blessing to me. She's a counselor, and I don't know if you ever know a counselor personally, because you always feel like they're analyzing you. I don't feel that with Nancy. She's a friend. And I value her opinion, and she listens to me, and I listen to her, and she makes me laugh. One day she called me and said, "Hey, Ev, do you want to get in my Jeep and go out to eat?" Well, she has this great Jeep, and this is her toy, and she's having a great time in life. So I welcome you, Nancy, and thank you so much for sharing.
Thanks. In some ways, that's really rude because it could make me cry right before I go up to teach. Thank you for your friendship, which is a gift to me. So I came and visited and spied on your class, and I was thinking, like, those of you that kind of know me, I really like to play when I'm not in my mental health practice because that's what helps me heal. So I'm very likely to get myself in trouble today at some point because I will say something that somebody is uncomfortable with, because when you work in mental health, you are so used to talking about everything in someone's life. And so there is nothing after 14 years that I have not talked about. And so sometimes it comes out. And my office is in Mannheim, and it got flooded during the recent rains. And so Mannheim Brethren in Christ Church has been hosting me, and they gave me their nursing mother's room. And so I've had some clients now for 3 weeks. I'm probably going to get back in my office next week, but this is a joke that got me in trouble with one of those pastoral staff that they just hired. So, like, in my head, I work these jokes, and I just think they're really, really funny. And sometimes when people tell me funny things, I will think of them later because it just brings entertainment to me. And so I work with a lot of business leaders, and these guys have been coming into the nursing mother's room to meet with me. And so the one day I'm like with this guy, I'm like, "Hey, you know, if you get a little pain in your side, it's probably because you're growing an ovary from all the estrogen in this room." And he thought it was a hoot. And I told one of the pastors there, like, he had like this nervous laugh that made it clear that he did not enjoy my joke. So I'm just gonna get like the stressful things out, just so you know. So put your seatbelt on as we work together today to talk through something. I have been geeking out on this passage of scripture for about a year now, and just digging and digging and digging, and Evie knew that. And so I was actually supposed to go to Rock in early August, or no, it was June. I forget, June. And because of the whole little war thing that happened there, it got bumped. And so I was hoping to bring a lot of, you know, deep awareness over the topic, and I'll share a little bit about that later. But, so now you don't get it. So we'll see how it goes today. But I want to start off by asking you, where do you meet with God? Like, I'm an interactive person as a therapist, so I do expect you to talk. But I'm just curious if some of you could share, where do you like to meet with God? Where are your places that you go?
McDonald's parking lot.
Okay.
Oh, you've done that for years. That's true.
Is that while you're waiting in line, or just it's your spot? Is there like one particular thing that like we can go mess with your rhythm sometime and show up there and park in your spot? Because that's what I would think of doing.
A lot of times I'll either go down to, is it Esplanade Road, down below Mount Joy, or in E-Town. And when I went down to Esplanade Road, I was actually feeding the birds. I kept a thing of bird seed in the back, and I also listened to a lot of audiobooks. And for me, it's just a cool experience. God's nature, I mean, it just, the amount of the variety that comes in there, and it's just a time that I can, for the most part, just focus on what's in front of me. There's nothing else around me except green grass and, you know, the birds that come in to eat the food, and His Word, or either His Word or through somebody that's an audible book. I like John Lennox. He's a great teacher.
How about for other people? Where do you meet with God?
For me, it's when I'm doing physical labor outside, especially in the garden. I don't know what it is, and it's not just sitting in the garden with a cup of coffee. Doesn't do it for me. It's when I'm physically doing labor, and the harder the labor, the more meditative it is, the more self-aware, the more I'm interacting with God, and that's when the prayers, and I feel like they're going up and being heard, and yeah, for me, that's where it is.
Okay. Anybody else want to share? Where do you meet with God?
I'm going to step out on a limb. Like you, I'm a therapist as well, so I like to play as well. I have a disc swing in our backyard that I like to lay on and just swing, and it's amazing just to lay there, feel the weight, you know, going back and forth, and just seeing above and just listening. So, and praying a lot when I do that. But yeah. So,
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love outdoor spaces too. For me, like, it's changed over seasons of my life. And when I was putting this together, thinking about this, I was thinking about my husband, and I did get permission to share this story, by the way, before, because this is one of the stories that could get me in trouble. My husband is so funny because he likes to sometimes do two things at once. So sometimes he picks one of the 2.5 throne rooms of my house to spend time with the Lord. And so, you know, sometimes he's in there for a long time, sometimes he's in there for a little time. So my next question is, what is the weirdest place you've ever spent time with God?
We used to be youth leaders years ago when we were younger, and we went to this camp called Circle K, and we'd all get in a line, and this dear leader of the camp took us through the woods and dropped us off at different places along the creek.
30 kids.
Under a tree with a verse above it, and we sit there and meditate until he came around and picked us up. It was a beautiful thing. Not how weird it was, but it was different.
Nice.
Very cool.
Any other places that are kind of out of the norm, what we would think of?
Hospital bathroom. It's a one place nobody's gonna bother me.
Exactly. Now the truths are coming out. Come on. We get some more.
In the shower.
The shower.
Yeah.
Nice. Nice. So as we think about our place that we go and meet God is like a sanctuary. It's a place of refuge. A refuge protects us from the dangers of the world, sometimes the dangers of our mind. And so our place where we meet with the Lord is a safe place. It's set apart. And I was thinking about this idea of refuge because over the last, about 2 weeks ago, we found a baby, well, I shouldn't say I did. My husband found a baby cat that was probably born from a feral cat right outside our house. And I didn't go out and look at it because I knew if I looked at it, it would be our cat, and I didn't want it to be our cat. And so he reached out to somebody at work that was like a cat lover and has nursed baby cats. And she said, you know, if the mom doesn't come back by this time, tell me. And so Paul is like the hero of the day to her because he did nothing, utterly nothing, other than call the woman at 9:30 at night one night, and she drove from Harrisburg to our house to pick up this baby cat and take it home and pay vet bills and everything else to bring it back to health, has been sending us updates of this baby cat. But if you think about like animal refuges, they're really safe places out of the weather, out of their traditional environment in order to heal. And I really think of our place with God as a place that's a safe place, a refuge from the other things of life, that is a place to heal, to be nurtured. And sometimes an animal can be re-released into the wild after it's had a time of healing, and sometimes it hasn't. And just like that, all of us sometimes need places to heal, refuge, places of refuge, sanctuary. In fact, as a therapist, I love safe places because nothing happens in my office until somebody feels safe. In fact, we have a whole nerve called the vagus nerve. It goes from our brainstem down to our gut, and it helps us with resiliency. And when people come into my office, and think about this, you have probably never shared something with another person that was deep to you unless you felt safe with them. Okay? And that's not really unusual. We're all that way. In fact, we also have something called neuroception, which means whether we realize it or not, our brain is always scanning for safety. We actually scan for safety before we're even consciously aware of it. and that is called neuroception, and there's a lot of great things coming out in neuroscience with mental health that I love. So when we think about where are the places throughout Bible that we see people meeting with God, Adam and Eve, they walked in the cool of the morning. They literally walked side by side God. I hope to be able to do that someday. In fact, as we see God's presence, even after they had to leave the garden, there's evidence that Cain and Abel also spoke directly to God, even outside the garden. In fact, when Cain killed Abel, there's evidence that even because he killed his brother, he still was in the presence of God. Because it wasn't until after that conversation with God that he said that Cain left his presence. And sometimes in the world of theology, there's something called folk theology, which is when we take on beliefs that aren't really biblical. But, and then we get up to professional theology, but we can sometimes propagate these ideas that aren't really true. And one of them is that somehow God doesn't hear us when we're sinners or when we sin, or that we somehow are away from God's presence. And that's just not true. In fact, there's plenty of evidence of God pursuing us even in our sin, all throughout the Bible, which I'm truly grateful for. Okay. When my kids were little, I have 3. I once told my kids at different points in time when they were frustrating me, I said, you know, in the Old Testament, if you were a rebellious child as a teenager, you could be stoned. To which my most clever child, which some of you, well, you probably could guess, but Sarah once said, I would be dead in a minute. And she's right. Thankfully, she's on the other side of that, which we are all very grateful for. But when we think about other ways that God communicated to his people, sometimes he talked through prophets, and prophets were kind of intermediaries. So they would go to a prophet and to discern what the will of God was. At other times, we see people communicating still directly through God, but we think about Mary and Joseph. An angel came and spoke to them. So sometimes he used other people to speak to us. And Jesus talked many times, went away to hide, to be away with his Father. Now, one of the other things I geeked out on this last year, and was this idea of Jesus would sometimes leave the crowds. And I read a book about this because sometimes work and even things that come before us as Christians can be overwhelming. Sometimes there's so much stuff we could do, and figuring out what do we say yes to and what do we say no to. But Jesus, even throughout time and his time on earth, often said no to things that were ministry opportunities or other good things to go and hide with God, to go speak with him. And sometimes people would invite him places and he would talk to God and he would know that that wasn't the right place for him and he would say no. Because he knew that the best place to be was wherever God had him to be. So when we think about all of these different locations where people communicated or met with God, we're going to kind of talk a little bit about some dynamics with the Old Testament. Now, when we look at the Old Testament, Adam and Eve in Genesis, we only have 3 chapters of the Bible that are dedicated to what life was like before sin, before the fall. And the whole rest of the Bible is all dedicated to life after that, where Jesus is engaging in relationship with us. And one of the common dynamics, and I like to talk about this because I don't ever assume if I'm with people that everybody has grown up in church, okay? And so when we think about what is like the big picture story of the Old Testament. So in the Old Testament, we see this ongoing relationship. God plucks the Jewish people out, and he says, you are my chosen people. And he said, basically, if you do what I tell you to do, life is just going to go well for you, okay? You'll have my blessing. And it's not that, you know, they had special favor, but most of his tips were just good life strategies. Okay? And so when we think about this dynamic between God and his people, we see this constant dynamic going on where they get happy, they're living in the blessing, then they get lazy, they start worshiping other gods, then they screw it up. God says, hey, if you want that to be your God, I'm going to back away. They usually end up in captivity to some other nation. And then they get unhappy, they cry out to God, and when they start to engage with God again, he says, I'm right here, just like a mom, right? Just like a mom or a dad, and says, I'm right here, I'm going to come get you. And so we see this beautiful dynamic, almost like a father and child, dynamic of God coming to the rescue of his people over and over and over and over again. He is a God who pursues. Think about this. When we think about Jonah and the whale, most of us have heard that story at some point. We don't see God saying, Jonah, I want you to do this. And Jonah says, no, God said, forget it. No. God pursues Jonah to the belly of a whale. In the same way, he pursues us. And pursues him relentlessly. And we see this dynamic over and over and over in the Old Testament, which I am truly grateful for. And I see this a lot, and I think about this a lot, because I have not had this experience, but I work with it all the time in my office of families who have kids who are far away from the Lord. And God is a God who pursues, and it's the one hope we all have, right? And we see him pursuing his people over and over. And I can't emphasize that enough. And so when we think about this relentless pursuit that God has with us, and we see him doing this over and over throughout, and there's story after story of this in the Bible, all the way to the point of the New Testament where he sends his son to pursue us. And so when we think about all of these ways that God interacts with us, I want you to think about a story in particular. We're going to talk today a lot about Moses. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of a quick overview. Moses, many of us know about, Moses was born, the leader at the time, the Pharaoh. He decided the Israelites, or sometimes called the Hebrew people, were in captivity. In other words, this was a time when they went away from the Lord. They ended up in slave labor to the Egyptians. And the Egyptian Pharaoh, who was the leader, said, you guys are getting way too many people. And so I'm going to kill all the baby boys. And so Moses was supposed to be a baby boy who was killed. But I don't know, the scripture doesn't say if his mom did this intentionally, like she was just a really clever cat, or if this was done quite by accident and it just turned out this way because of divine providence. We don't know. But she basically puts her son in a basket and floats him down, and downstream is Pharaoh's daughter. Okay, and she picks up baby Moses out of the basket, and then what happens from there is she decides she likes it, kind of like the stray cat. Okay, and she looks at the baby, falls in love with this baby, and turns out that she needs to find somebody to nurse this baby. Baby Moses ends up being taken care of by his very own mother, who was his wet nurse, and then stays with her for 6 or 7 years in the Hebrew land. Then goes to Pharaoh's, temple, is raised in Pharaoh's temple, and then when he's 40 years old, he goes out and sees his people being mistreated because he knows he's Hebrew. And so he goes and kills a guy out of protection, gets found out, runs away, goes to the desert, and when he's 80 years old, after living in the desert for 40 years, God calls him out to come and get the Israelites. Now, those of you who are thinking 80 years old, okay, my friend who works in my office, because I have a shared cooperative space, she's like an HR guru, and she recently told me that their Gallup report just came out in research that figured out when our most productive years were. And it gave me great hope, okay, because I'm 52. And believe it or not, our most productive years are 60 to 70. Blew me away, okay, recent research. And I'm not even there yet, which gives me even more hope. Okay, and so we think about Moses at 80 years old, and he goes back and through a whole series of things with the king, or the Pharaoh, who, remember, the Lord, divine providence, I'm gonna pull this out later, he literally grew up in this home, knew what to expect, was familiar with their customs, okay, and then went and talked and convinced the Pharaoh through God to release the people, takes them out, crosses the Red Sea, and then lands in the desert. Now, if those of you who might have know this, it would have taken, God had directed him to take them back to Israel, which was considered the promised land. That's what the Bible refers to it as. And it should have only taken them about 2 weeks if they had gone the direct route from Egypt to Israel. But these were traumatized people. They had lived in captivity. They were slaves. They were traumatized people. Okay? They had a lot to learn. Moses knew how to live in the desert because he lived in it for 40 years. Right? So he had already been pre-trained to know how to live in this space. Okay? And so he goes up Mount Sinai. God gives him 10 commandments. People during that time already are afraid. Okay? Fearful people disobey. And so what happens is the people don't trust Moses and they don't trust God, and they start to come up with their own way again. Okay, they just saw huge miracles, which I'm not going to go into every one, but there's like tons of miracles that God showed his faithfulness and love for them. He provides food and water for them in the desert, and they still do not trust him enough to make him their God, and so they rebel. And so during this time, all the time, and this happens in all of our life, when we look at the bigger picture of what God is walking us through, and even through all the stories of the Old Testament, God was doing great things through his people, but it wasn't just to do the great thing for the people, it was to do a great thing in the individual. Because even while Moses was leading people to Israel, God was working with Moses too. He was shaping Moses' heart. He was shaping his relationship with Moses as well. And so by this time, Moses and God are working out their own relationship. And I love hearing the stories and reading about the stories of Moses and his relationship with God, because we're going to enter a very specific part of the story in Exodus 33. Because by this time, Moses is sick of the Israelites. God is sick of them too, because they keep going back and forth. And he says this in chapter 32. Chapter 32, God's like, forget it, Moses. I'm really sick of them. I'm just going to wipe them out. And Moses is like, slow down, God. Okay? Slow down. You can't bring them out into the desert when all these other nations are watching them, even though they're rebellious, and take them all out. And we don't know what God's ultimate motive was for saying that. But clearly, they talked like friends. And all of us that have walked through parenting has walked through this dynamic of feeling really frustrated with your kids, right? We're like, really? I could leave them at the bathroom at the McDonald's maybe. You know what I mean? Because they're just difficult sometimes. And that's essentially what God is kind of saying, like, okay, Moses, I'm really sick of them. And Moses is like, no, you can't leave me in this humanitarian crisis. Let's, get them where they're supposed to be. And maybe God was saying to Moses, hey, I need you to fight for these people because they're going to frustrate you a lot more, kind of like parenting, right? And so we enter this dynamic where after God gave them the 10 Commandments, people sinned and did all this crazy stuff, then we get to this scene where they're creating structure in the desert because they're going to be there for a while, okay? They're going to be there for a while. And now they have to start creating some structures on how they're going to function out in the desert. And there's this beautiful passage in Exodus 33. And if somebody could pull up Exodus 33, I'm going to ask someone to read this passage. Could somebody read? Okay, now, if you can, try to be really dramatic about it. And those of you that are listening, when you hear this, I want you to imagine yourself out in the desert. Okay. You've seen some amazing things from God, but you're kind of afraid. You might not know how to live in the desert. You're walking through and there's a ton of people. You don't know if you're going to have food for tomorrow, or at least you don't trust it. And so I want you to really put yourself in the story, because we're going to talk about where Moses met with God. Who could read for us in a very dramatic way Exodus 33, verse 6 to verse 11. I'm going to put that up here just so you know. Do we have any takers? Did I put you under too much pressure to make it dramatic? I'm sorry. I'm looking at you because you're pastor, right?
You're professional.
Exactly! That's exactly what I was thinking. Are you up for it?
Yeah, I'm up for it.
Ah, that's great.
What am I reading?
33, Exodus 33, verse 6 to 11.
Yeah, this print's very small, but.
That's okay.
So the Israelites stripped off their ornaments at Mount Horeb. Now Moses used to take a tent and pitch it outside the camp some distance away, calling it the tent of meeting. Anyone inquiring of the Lord would go to the tent of meeting outside the camp. And whenever Moses went out to the tent, all the people rose and stood at the entrance to their tents, watching Moses as he entered the tent. As Moses went into the tent, the pillar of cloud would come down and stay at the entrance, while the Lord spoke with Moses. Whenever the people saw the pillar of cloud standing at the entrance of the tent, they all stood and worshipped, each at the entrance to their tent. The Lord would speak to Moses face to face, as one speaks to a friend. Then Moses would return to the camp, but his young aide Joshua, son of Nun, did not leave the tent.
Thank you. So when I hear certain passages the first time, I'm just trying to take in the information. So I'm going to reread it again, and maybe we'll do it a third time, because I want you to drink it in. I want it to fall over you. Thank you. You did a great job reading that. So Moses used to take a tent and pitch it outside the camp, a good distance from the camp. He called it the tent of meeting. Everyone who sought the Lord would go out to the tent of meeting, which was outside of camp. It came about that whenever Moses went out to the tent, that all the people would arise and stand, each at the entrance of his tent, and gaze after Moses until he entered the tent. Whenever Moses entered the tent, the pillar of cloud would descend and stand at the entrance of the tent. And the Lord would speak with Moses. When all the people saw the pillar of cloud standing at the entrance of the tent, all the people would stand and worship, each at the entrance of his tent. So the Lord used to speak to Moses face to face, just as a man speaks to his friend. When Moses returned to camp, his servant Joshua, the son of Nun, a young man, would not depart from the tent. This whole passage has so much rich content. And I'm going to pull out 5 thoughts from this passage that I think are takeaways. Now, I want you to think about a tent. This was a temporary place, a portable sanctuary for the people to meet with God. Now, tents at that time probably had lots of layers. People tried to make them as, nice as possible because they're going to be living in it for a long time. And I was looking up some tents of the Middle East and maybe some things. And tents throughout history have been made of a lot of different things. Sometimes bark, sometimes animal bones. Okay, chances are they had some sort of fabric that they were making the tents out. I didn't have enough time to research it fully. I'd hoped to be able to, bring some really cool stuff from Iraq because I'm going to get to work in some refugee camps there. But when we think about tents, okay, I read some things about military tents that are made of canvas. And canvas is a very breathable material, but the whole premise is that in rain, the canvas, the fibers of a canvas tent will expand, which makes it waterproof. But they take a lot of wear and tear. Okay? And I would imagine these tents in the desert would be taking a lot of wear and tear as well. And yet God found this way of making a sacred sanctuary for Moses to meet with God. Okay, and we're going to talk a little bit about what are some of the takeaways from this passage. Because as we take this detour, it's clear that the tent was separate from camp. That's what the Bible says. And so it's clear that God saw the need to give Moses a place far away from the people, a sanctuary outside of the space that they were in, because he would need it. Similar to what Jesus would do in the New Testament when he would go out into different places to have time alone. And so when we think about how our brain functions, a lot of times in corporate life, businesses and companies will do what we call offsites, which is a way of going someplace out of their daily rhythm because our brain works on rhythms and habits. And so what happens is we get in a routine. Like this morning, you probably did not think about the fact of what order you got ready. You just do your thing, however you do it. You probably brushed your teeth, went to the bathroom, changed your clothes, that kind of thing. You're probably not really thinking about the rhythm or patterns that you have, but we all have them. And part of the reason is once we start doing something long enough, it becomes a routine. We have neural pathways, we build these habits. We don't think about it, which takes a lot less energy for our brain, believe it or not. It reduces the amount of time we have to think about it. So when we go someplace or do something new, suddenly our brain has to be more creative. We have to figure out how are we going to do this. That happens on missions trips where you're living with people and you're trying to figure out how to be in each other's space. And suddenly you're putting all this mental energy and effort. How do I hide the things I don't want people to know about me? How do I, do this kind of stuff? And so offsites are often a way of getting company leaders outside of their routine. And so this tent of meeting kind of is like a company offsite. It's like a way of saying you need to get away from things to be able to look over things and see what's going on. And so our time with the Lord can be a way of having like an off-site meeting, right? We can have a tent of meeting, a place that's off-site or someplace else out of our normal routine so that we can be creative and listen, and our brain has a tendency to pay way more attention. So the first thought I want to share with you is when we think about this idea of where do you spend time with God, it matters. And sometimes we need to go to someplace new. I've done silent retreats at Abbey before, a couple of times, and just had a great time with the Lord. Place to go someplace new, have a lot of quiet, okay, and just have some time to be quiet and allow my body and brain to heal. We function well that way. The other thing that I want to pull out about this passage is anyone could go to the tent of meeting, okay, and in the same way, any of us can go and be with the Lord. I don't know during that time. I'd be curious to know, maybe someday when I'm in heaven, I'll ask that question to Moses, how many people actually use the tent of meeting? Everybody had access to it. We don't get really a sense that who did and who didn't, but we know that Moses did it. As a great leader, he was modeling how important this was to the people. But he had enough relational equity that when he would go, everybody was watching. Because they knew he was going to be talking to God about them. And so much so that they sat at their tent and watched. Wow. Really, really important. And this next point I'm going to make is probably my favorite and most important. And that is that Moses spoke to God as a friend. I don't know what it's like for you when you talk to God, okay? But he talked to him like a friend. How many of us consciously think about talking to God like a friend? Because sometimes when I talk to my friends, the friends that I can be really like open and honest about, it's a little bit messy. Sometimes they hear my dark and twisty thoughts. Abby has gotten like 80 to 90% of them. You know, I can't say I share everything, but a large portion of them. And I know that she's going to love me and accept me and give me the little Abby giggle, which I love, and all of you know. And she just thinks it's good. You know, she just loves me. I don't have to think about it. And that's what you can do when you're in a real trusting relationship. And keep in mind, Moses has been working out his relationship with God for 80 years. So he's not holding anything back. And as a therapist, I value authentic engagement. Okay? And that's exactly how Moses talked to God. That means he was probably telling God all of his dark and twisty thoughts. Now here's the thing, God already knows all of our dark and twisty thoughts because of something called omniscience, which means that God knows everything. But in the same way, God wants to hear it from us, not from other people. Now, we can all hear about the fire that happened at the Jolene house. Or we can go and say, tell me about it. It's a different experience, right? It's different than hearing something in the newspaper and knowing it's true versus when somebody says, I want to hear from you. Because it's about our relationship, not about reading something apart. And that's how God wants to be with us. Okay? He wants our real and true, genuine, dark, twisty thoughts all to love us and accept them as they are. And if you look through Psalms, you can see a lot of the King David's dark, twisty thoughts. Okay? Because he didn't hold anything back, and God thought he was like really great. And so when we think about this idea of authentic communication and how he would just talk to him like a friend. And there's so many beautiful passages, if you like to geek out on this stuff like I do, about how Moses talked to God and his fears. Like, God, are you really going to be there? Because I don't really want to do this unless you're there. Okay, don't leave me with these people, basically. And we see that all through these passages between Moses and God, because God wasn't just trying to do something through Moses. He was trying to do something in Moses. Because God could use anybody. In fact, usually he uses the weirdest people to do amazing things all through the Old Testament because he wants people to know it's not because it was that person and how great they were, it's because of how great I am, and I don't want them to get the glory because it was all that God's to be had. And so if God's using you, that's because he's trying to use you to reveal his glory, and you might be a little bit like the weirdest person in the room because that's how God works, because he wants people to know it's not about you, it's about me. And I'm going to give you an opportunity to bear witness to what I'm trying to do. And I'm going to do something in you in the process. Okay? So the next thought I like to pull out about this passage is the idea that Joshua, this blew me away when I read this. Now, those of you who have grown up in church might know about some other stories about Joshua. Okay? Joshua eventually became the leader of the Israelites when they entered the Promised Land, which is Israel. But Joshua's training ground started way before he would lead the people into Israel. In fact, Joshua was on Mount Sinai when God gave him the 10 Commandments. He was an attendant to Moses. He sat outside this tent of meeting and heard these conversations. Joshua would also be one of 12 spies who would go into the Promised Land to see what the Promised Land was like and to understand what the people were like and report it back to Moses. He also later, in his preparation for leadership, was the leader who surrounded Jericho, which was, I think, the first place they went in the Promised Land. And so we see the training ground for leadership not at the point when they enter their leadership position, but way earlier in the journey. Okay? Slowly, we see this over time with many great leaders of the Bible, like David. The training ground happened way earlier. And so Joshua was literally growing up hearing this dialogue, learning how to have relationship with God, learning how to lead these difficult people, which is powerful because if we think about parenting or even people that you may mentor, it's a process of inviting them into our lives and hearing the ins and outs. Okay? And Joshua didn't want to leave the tent. How cool is that? I wouldn't want to either. He got to see all of these things face to face, which are the training grounds for leadership. And the last point I want to pull out about this passage, but we're not going to be done quite yet, is that the tent of meetings, later there's a little bit of a slightly more permanent place called the tabernacle, which was, that would become the place where people would meet with God. And if you've heard about it, it was kind of a little funny little tent, but it would become a temporary space for people to, sacrifice animals for their sins so that they would learn that bad behavior or sin hurts people. Okay? And the tent of meeting, later, it's referred to all the time in these passages, would later become the outer courtyard of the tabernacle. And it was like God was already training them towards obedience, that time with him was important, that it requires something of us. And it would later be transformed in a new way of knowing God through the tabernacle. And so as we think about a tent, and as you think about Moses, see, Moses never actually got to enter the Promised Land. So by the time he was 40 years as a young adult, 40 years in the desert training, then he's another 40 years in the desert with these people who are difficult. And then he gets to go right to the entrance of the Promised Land, and he doesn't get to go in because he sinned against God. Because his position meant that what he said and did mattered, and that meant that when he did something wrong, it mattered all the more. And so what we see is this guy whose whole life revolved around this group of people and potentially going into the Promised Land, and the most he ever got to do was see over the edge of it. How disappointing. If I were in the desert, I would have been dreaming of the Promised Land every day. This is what it's going to be like. I'm going to have grapes. I'm going to have all my favorite foods. I'm going to have a house that looks like this. I hope the land has this in it. I would have been dreaming about it all the time. And I would imagine Moses might have been doing the same. And he never got to enter it. And what a huge disappointment would that be? We all have huge disappointments in life. And sometimes we have these ideas of what something's going to be like, and we don't always get to be there. And so I want to go back to this idea of the tent. Because when we think about tents need tender care. They take a lot of wear and tear. And when I was geeking out on this passage, I was starting to think, I wonder if they make tent repair kits. So I started Google searching for tent repair kits. Sure enough, this is a military tent repair kit. Now it doesn't have all the equipment in it, but look how big it is. It's kind of big, right? This actually survived my flood in Mannheim. I had to, I was in water. I still need to wash it. But the fact that this exists is so fascinating to me Because so many times in our faith walk with God, sometimes we need a tent repair kit. Because our tents start to take on some wear and tear. Maybe they've been out in the sun and they baked, maybe they have a little dry rot. Okay, I would imagine that would have been an issue. Maybe they take on some rips. Maybe our tent is just, in such need of great repair. So much so that we need a divine tent repair kit. A place to go to heal. And we need God to bring his repair kit. And the great thing about God is because he pursues us so much, it brings him great joy to do that. And I don't know what the state of your tent is in right now. If you're saying, man, my spiritual life is in need of repair. It's getting a little tossed and turned by life right now, and I'm hurting a little bit. I'm walking through some stuff that are difficult. Had a lot of big shifts in my life the last 2 years. Okay, and maybe it's why this passage meant so much to me, as I was thinking about my own journey through the desert. Because we all walk through deserts, and sometimes we wish our desert would be 2 weeks long, and it's 40 years. And we weren't expecting that. We weren't expecting the conditions to be so hard. Because a tent is a temporary living space. It's not meant to be our home. And we aren't home yet either. We are in a temporary living state. And sometimes I don't like it very much, and I argue with the Lord in my own tent of meeting about his decisions. Now, he usually wins. Okay? But it doesn't mean we don't have some discussions about it. And sometimes he gives me a good dressing down. And sometimes he's like, yeah, Nance, it'll be different when you're here. And we all have to walk through those things in some way or facet. And at my age, and I'm sure many of you, because there's a lot of mature faces in this room, we start to realize what the world is really like. And there's some things where you're like, yeah, this is different than what I expected. There's a lot more pain here than what I imagined. And I know that I'm not home. And it feels a lot less like home the older I get. I start dreaming about the promised land. But in the meantime, we're called to live in tents. We're called to live in a land that really isn't home. And sometimes we need each other, because that's the great gift that God gave to all of us, which is relationship. Thankfully, the Israelites were all stuck together. Misery truly loves company, and God said, I'm going to let you be miserable together. Okay, just like God didn't want to be miserable without Moses, and Moses didn't want to be miserable about the Israelites without him. And it's important that as we walk through this life together, that we help repair each other's tents, that we come alongside of each other. So for our last 15 minutes, we're going to spend some time in small groups. And what I would recommend is that you go someplace, and I haven't really thought about how to do this. Hopefully we can just kind of self-organize into groups of like 4. But I would rather you get into a group without your spouse, okay? And I know this is so uncomfortable, especially if you're an introvert, okay? Now, I told you I'm a therapist, so deep places are my playground. And after doing this for a lot of years, one of the things I realized is that not everybody likes to go as deep as I do. And so I gave you one of 4 questions to think about and to share. So you can pick, when you break into these groups, any one of these 4 questions. So if you're not like ready to be full throttle, vulnerable, and authentic, pick the easiest one to you. Okay? But I want you to organize in groups of 4. Okay, it doesn't have to be girls and boys. You can be, boys and girls in the same group. Okay, but I want you to take a risk. I want you to take a risk of thinking, okay, how do I talk authentically about one of these questions? You don't all have to answer the same question. You get to pick. And I want you to respect each other's decision on whatever question they decide to answer. Okay? Because we're just going to listen. We're not going to have judgments. We're not going to try to help them. We're just going to answer the question. You can tell people what question you picked, and then just answer it, and just say thank you for sharing. We're just going to be present. Okay, remember, we all like to be miserable with company. Nobody wants to be miserable alone. Okay, I'm really good at complaining with the Lord, really good at complaining with my husband. It's all good, okay? So if there's something heavy on your heart, you can share it. If there's something that you're not ready to share, and you want to share something like medium level risk, that's okay too. Okay? okay? You get to pick. So let's break up into groups of 4, and if you're struggling, I will be watching, okay? And I will find a place for you, because everybody deserves to belong somewhere. I want everybody to feel super duper safe, okay? And I will be more than willing to pull you in, okay? So, let's walk through the awkwardness of finding a
Count
group.
off 1, 2, 3,
Yeah, I know.
1, 2, 3.